Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for the invitation. And again, thank you to Justin to come on such short notice. I sent an email to Justin just last week and telling him about the conference, and he graciously accepted the invitations. And I think it means a lot to the students. And again, thank you very much. We're very happy to have you here. So what I'm going to do today, I'm just going to promotion, basically. I'm going to promote my course, or the courses in monetary econ, but I'm going to tell you why we teach what we teach, and hopefully related to the kind of tools you're going to learn that's going to be useful when you apply for a job such as the Bank of Canada or any other kinds of jobs that sort of is in the money macro finance area. Okay. So I'm going to start with this cartoon. Some of you who've taken my class know that I always put cartoons up. So this tells a lot about how people feel about macroeconomists. People think that we have no idea about what we're talking about or no idea about what's going on. But we do. We're not always right. In fact, we're many times wrong, but we do know what's going on to a large extent. So there was this nice article in the New York Times in November 2010, and the title was Macroeconomics is Hard, in the sense that it's a hard subject. It's not easy to be a macroeconomist, especially after the Great Recession. Macroeconomics and macroeconomists took a lot of heat for not being able not only to predict the recession, but to also sort of explain it carefully why it happened. Well, I'm going to defend macroeconomics here and say that it's a hard subject. I mean, we have lots of amazingly brilliant people working on models in macro, but it's not an easy subject. It's not easy to model the interactions of billions of people, so you can imagine trying to sort of have a model with, I don't know, 10 equations, 50 equations, trying to represent billions of behavior. I don't think that's possible. We deal with a lot of uncertainty. It comes from model, it comes from data, it comes from shock. We don't know what shock has happened sometimes. And the thing is, with econ compared to sciences, we don't have experimental data. We don't have lab data. So we can't do experiments as sciences would do. So we can't just flip a switch and restart again. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So that limits our ability actually to get good answers from models. Macroeconomists usually face two challenges. The first one is, I think, harder than the second one. The first one is explaining the past. For example, the Great Recession that we went through, we are still trying to explain that. We're still trying to explain the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we're still trying to explain many past events. That's not easy to do. If we can't explain very well the past, at least we're trying. Forecasting the future, well, that's not easy at all. This is not a doodle from my 4-year-old. It's actually the forecast of US GDP from the survey of professional forecasters in the US. The black line is actually actually what happened. The red lines are forecasts from models, and the gray lines are the forecast from professional forecasters. Everyone got the direction more or less right. Some of them are really wrong, as you can see here, those guys, for example. But the magnitude were off. I mean, that's a growth rate, right? So if we're talking a difference between 8% versus 2%, that's a huge difference. That's a couple of trillions of dollars. So forecasting is not easy at all. And I think the more I look at it, I've come to the conclusion that maybe we should not do forecasting at all, to a large extent, because no matter how good the models are, there's too much noise in the data, there's too much sort of uncertainty around what we're trying to forecast that it's very, very hard to do. And I think that we are starting to understand that very well. Okay. So faced with those challenges, I say don't despair. What you need is really good training. And I think the training comes in three sort of dimensions. One of them is you have to be well trained in the data and understand the data very well, where it's coming from, what sort of properties the data has. So develop very good empirical skills. You have to be very good in theory, in models. So the theory is always going to be around. And sometimes, yes, we bore you with models, but this is the bread and butter of what we do. Models, theory, always very, very important. And the last part that you unfortunately don't learn very much in classes is how to communicate your results. I think this is skills that we don't develop enough as in classes, but that's tremendously important. Okay, so those are the sort of the free courses apart from the O2 courses that you have at Waterloo that you could sort of take if you're interested in central banking, in that sort of work. 304, which is a very introductory, it's an introductory course in money macro. It's a very descriptive course. I mean, I don't think you would go very far with just 304, for example. You won't be able to work at the Bank of Canada with just 304. You have to have much more training. With sort of the course that will sort of allow you to get a bit more training on data and models would be 404 and 604 at the graduate level. Those two courses are fairly similar, except that sort of the topics are very similar, but the pace is very different. 604 would cover about twice as much as you would cover in 404 with about the same time. But it's more or less the same topics. So in my introduction, I talked about three things: data, model, and communication. And this is the sort of thing that is replicated in most of the course outline in Econ2014. So you will be trained in data, what to do with macro data, how to handle it, filter it, how to interpret the data. And one of the big tools that sort of when I teach that course, I spend about 3 weeks on are vector autoregressions. This is a very important tool that macroeconomists should have, and we use that tool a lot to answer policy questions, basically. And then you will be trained in models. Nowadays, most central banks will have a model that is very similar to each other, and it's of a flavor what we call a new Keynesian model. It's a model that is derived from optimization, so it's a micro-founded model that includes nominal frictions. So, and within that model, you can do a lot of interesting questions. You can ask questions about whether price level targeting is better than inflation targeting. If so, when? What sort of policy should the central bank do? And even questions if the model includes financial frictions, such as what type of regulation should you have. And you also have models about credit cycles and financial frictions, which are sort of becoming much more important nowadays, given what has happened. So if you work as a macroeconomist, whether at the Bank of Canada or in the private sector, I think you should have these sort of 3 good skills. One, understand the data very well, where it's coming from, what to do with it, what sort of properties of the data there are, and how to deal with them. You should understand time series econometrics very well, especially VAR, and you should be able to understand and build dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which is more or less the type of models used at central banks and most financial institutions nowadays. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one and give you an example of what is done in a class, and Justin is going to sort of take this to a next level and show you how actually the Bank of Canada uses those tools to implement monetary policy, which is at the end of the day the main job of the Bank of Canada. So again, if you are faced with macro data or even micro data, you should be able to know what's in the data, so understand the trends, the correlation, the dynamic properties of the data. So there are various tools that you can learn to deal with that, things such as filtering, detrending, dynamic correlation, coherence. And one of the examples I have here is directly related to what the Bank of Canada considers as one of the important measures of excess capacity that is a key driver of inflation, which is the output gap. The output gap is the difference in very simple terms between what is produced and what can be potentially produced. Okay, so think of this as a measure of either excess demand when you demand less than what is supplied. When you demand more than what is supplied, so it's a measure of excess demand, or a measure of excess supply when you demand less than what is produced. This measure of output gap is one of the drivers of inflation because it feeds into models, and sometimes it's used on its own as a measure of capacity. So the idea that I have in mind here is a simple transmission mechanism when you have excess demand that feeds into prices, and when you have excess supply that feeds into prices by lowering prices. So one of the things that you can run, and that takes me 5 minutes to run on MATLAB, on my Mac, is an unobserved component model. So this is one of the models that the Bank of Canada would use. My model that I have here is a bit different from the bank, but I can produce a measure of the output gap. So the blue line is the output gap. So whenever it's below 0, that measures excess supply, and whenever it is above 0, that measures excess demand. So you would think that when you have excess demand, you would have pressures on prices to go up, and when you have excess supply, you have pressures on prices to go down. And you can see the huge negative output gap during the Great Recession, according to this measure. And I can do forecasts with that. So this is my forecast of the economy going forward. I'm not very far from what the Bank of Canada is saying, actually, regarding inflation and the output gap. The Bank of Canada, in their monetary policy report, says that inflation is going to gradually move back to 2% by 2017, and the output gap is going to be closed more or less by then. This is more or less what my model is saying. The thing is, I'm not going to oversell that result, because look at the shaded area around my forecast here, this huge area. That's my confidence interval, my 95% confidence interval. As an economist, when I teach classes, I always tell people never to oversell your result. So be aware how big that confidence interval is, but the point forecast is surrounded by this huge amount of uncertainty. But it tells you that if you get the proper training, and if you're working at the Bank of Canada or in the private sector, and you are asked to produce a measure of the output gap, you can do that very, very easily once you know what you're doing and you've got the proper training. So the second thing that's very important is knowledge of time series econometrics. Now, there are courses on campus that you can take, either in the applied math department or in the econ department, that will teach you time series, basic time series. Now, if you look at the area of time series, you have lots of things you can learn. Here I have error correction model, co-integration, unobserved component, time-varying parameters. But for the Bank of Canada, if you have to choose one thing that you should learn, it's vector autoregression. And that's a central tool for macroeconomists nowadays. So what is a vector autoregression? It's a system of equation where all the variables are endogenous, and each variable depends on the lag of itself and the lags of other variables. So what the vector autoregression does, it captures the rich dynamics between macro variables. So we know that for example, when interest rate goes up, output falls, and when output falls, that feeds back again in interest rate. If you have a single equation, you're not going to get that feedback, the second round effect. You need a vector. You need a vector autoregression that captures these dynamics between these macro variables. So we use vector autoregressions a lot to do things such as forecasting and policy. But one thing that we use vector autoregression in monetary econ is to identify monetary policy shock. So one of the challenges that we face is we observe the outcome. We observe GDP going up and down, but we don't know the cause. So we need to establish the cause, and one of the things that we can do is identify the shock, which is not easy at all to do, and the VAR is a very sort of nice tool to do that. For example, one of the things that you can ask is, if the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve Bank decreases interest rate, how much would that affect output? How much would that affect inflation? That's a very simple research question. So the VAR allows you to do that. So here I have an example of a VAR that I teach in class of the US economy. So here I have my experiment is a decrease in the Fed funds rate. So the Federal Reserve Bank is decreasing interest rate by 70 basis points. And theory tells you that you should expect output to go up, inflation to go up, and hours work to go up, etc., consumption and investment to go up. This is basically what you get, except that on impact, you have this weird result from inflation that's known as a price puzzle, but eventually inflation goes up. So here you can answer this question, how much would output change if there is a 1% change in the interest rate? So here, a 70 basis point change would increase output by about 0.3%. So you get not only the magnitude, the direction, and also how much and how large are the effects. So VARs are becoming a very, very important tool for any macroeconomist to have, and especially to do monetary policy. So if you want to be well trained in macroeconomics, VAR is definitely a tool that you should have. Now, if we could do experiments in macro, we would never use models. Unfortunately, we cannot do experiments in econ. One of the reasons why we can't do that is because we don't have a lot of natural experiments. So you don't have governments waking up tomorrow and saying, well, we're going to separate from Canada. Actually, we do now, right? So that would be a nice natural experiment to have. If Quebec separates tomorrow, then it's a complete exogenous, you can say endogenous to some extent, but it's an exogenous sort of decision. You can analyze the impact of this. But you don't get a lot of these so-called natural experiments in econ. You can't do experiments on actual economies. We can't just wake up tomorrow and say, let's see the effects of adopting the US dollar. You can't do that. And we don't observe counterfactual. Things like what would have happened if the Federal Reserve Bank did not do anything during the financial crisis. We don't observe these things in the data. What we can do is our experiments using models. So models are our labs where we conduct counterfactuals, where we conduct experiments. And unfortunately, this is what we have. And we have to construct good models. And we are able to construct good models. And if you look at what kinds of models we have, at central banks, we would use a class of models known as dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. So those are think of your two-period model that you learn in 302, for example, but where all the sectors are accounted for, where it's a general equilibrium model with all the sectors, where it's coming from micro foundations. So the households are modeled, the firms are modeled, the banks are modeled, the central banks are modeled. So every sector is modeled carefully. And you can run experiments, you can run policy questions in these models. So the last couple of years, we've seen a greater role for financial frictions in these models because of the importance of financial frictions. But the basic structure of many of these models has a three-equation structure. The first equation is more or less your IS curve that you learn in 102, but this is a very different beast because it's forward-looking. The second equation is a Phillips curve that you also learn. It's also a different beast because it has forward-looking elements. And the third equation is just a reaction function of a central bank that says that the central bank raises interest rate when inflation is positive or above some target or when the output gap is positive. Now, the model can be summarized by this sort of chart. What is important are this block here. We think nowadays that in these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, what drives most of the things are expectations. Okay? And we believe that the central bank can play a central role in affecting expectations. Just to give you a very simple example, the Bank of Canada has targeted inflation since 1991, and when you look at inflation, inflation has been very stable since 1995, around 2%. So the Bank of Canada has done a very good job, has gained credibility. So when the Bank of Canada is telling you in its monetary policy report that inflation will be at 2%, then that says that probably inflation will be at 2%. So if you're going to go to your employer and ask for a wage increase next year, you're not going to ask for 6%, you're going to ask for 2% because you believe inflation will be 2%. And because you ask for 2%, you actually get 2% inflation the next year. So inflation drives, and I go back to this model, you can see that inflation drives a lot of what actually happens. So managing expectations has become a key thing for central bank nowadays, and understanding how expectation drives actual values, that's a very important thing. Not to say that these productivity shocks, these markup shocks, these demand shocks are not important, but it seems that we can do much better as central banks if we can affect expectations. And that's something that you will learn when you do models that I have here. So one of the things you can do in this model is ask a very simple question. Would inflation targeting, as most central banks do nowadays, be better than price level targeting in this very simple model? It turns out that in this model, price level targeting would be better because price level targeting allows you to affect expectations that feeds back onto the actual variable. Now, you would not be able to do that without a model, that sort of question. And the Bank of Canada, Justin can tell you more about this, has devoted a lot of resources to that question. When is price level targeting superior to inflation targeting? They've devoted 3 or 4 years of research on this question. Even when I was there 10 years ago, I did research on this. So you can see how important this question is. So you cannot get an answer from the data. You need a model. And the type of model that you have is going to, of course, dictate your answer. So one thing you will learn in Econ is you can basically build any model to give you an answer. We're pretty good at building models. Right? You can sort of think of this transmission mechanism, try to model it properly, and you get your answer. The big question is what model to choose, or which model to choose. If you're faced with model A or model B, and they give you very different answer, which one to choose? For example, a very typical question is, what happens after a technology shock? So if you have a positive technology shock, what happens to hours work? There's a popular class of model called real business cycle in macro that tells you that hours work increases. And the intuition is very simple. You have better technology, your wages go up, so you take advantage of that, you work more. But there's a class of model that I just showed you, that new Keynesian model, that tells you actually hours work fall following a positive technology shock. And that's basically because prices are sticky, so firm cannot pass on this decrease in prices to consumers, so they decrease hours. Now, which model is correct? You have to go to the data to do that. One of the things that macroeconomists have done is use VARs. But unfortunately, one thing that you will find is, in most cases, the data is not rich enough to give you answer about whether model A is better than model B. So the econometrician can be as good as he or she is, but the econometrician is going to be limited by the data. There is a lack of experimental data. We don't have that in Econ, unfortunately, or we do have some experimental data, but it's sort of very small sample. The data sets are very small when you look at macro data, and even if you think that you can accumulate data, well, you're out of luck because there are important structural changes that go over time, but you can't use the whole data set. But you can only use part of a data set where no structural change has happened. You can model the structural change, but that's not very, very easy to do. So as a macroeconomist, you face all these challenges. You face the challenges of the data. Sometimes data is not available. Sometimes the data is noisy. You face the challenge of having the appropriate model, which model to choose. And when you put everything together, that's why it's important to have all these skills, so that you can sort of, if you think of an analogy of risk management, you sort of put your eggs in different baskets. So that at the end of the day, you don't put your eggs in the same basket, so your forecast or your interpretation comes from different sources, and you can take each one with some grains of salt. So always be cautious when interpreting your result. Never oversell your results, because if you're doing forecasting, for example, the confidence intervals are always very, very large, and people tend to forget that. Now, one thing that's very, very important is you should be able to communicate your results effectively. I mean, in the econ courses that you're going to take, we don't do a very good job at teaching you those skills. And it's partly students' fault as well, because you guys don't ask questions. That's what I find sort of puzzle me all the time when I teach. I can put more or less garbage on the board, and everyone would just look at me. No, you should ask questions. I think questions are important, and sort of that gets you to understand things and sort of makes you think about what is being taught here. So always try to sort of improve your communication and your writing skills. Those are very, very important skills, because at the end of the day, being an economist is about storytelling. So you have to be able to put a story to your model. You should be able to put a story to your data. And if you don't have the proper communication skills, you can be a very good mathematician, a very good model builder or econometrician. That will go to waste at the end of the day. That's it for me. Thank you, guys.